Throw it away, Ethan Caldwell said without looking up, his voice smooth, final, the kind of voice that ended conversations before they began, and the room obeyed him like gravity itself, a quiet ripple of nods moving across the long glass table as assistants gathered papers, laptops clicked shut, and the soft hum of the city 30 floors below filled the silence he left behind. Near the door, half in shadow, Ava Brooks paused with a stack of discarded printouts in her hands, the faint scent of lemon cleaner still clinging to her sleeves, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges as she glanced down at the page on top, a contract marked in red ink. One line circled not with authority but instinct, something about it sitting wrong in a way she couldn't ignore. The overhead lights reflected off the polished marble floor beneath her feet, cold and bright, and for a moment she considered doing what everyone expected. Drop it, move on, disappear, but instead she stepped forward, her shoes making almost no sound, her presence barely noticeable until she spoke. "It's not trash," she said quietly, and that was enough to stop the motion in the room, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for a few heads to turn, for one assistant to hesitate mid-step, for Ethan's pen to pause above the document he hadn't yet signed. He didn't look at her immediately, and when he did, it was with a kind of detached curiosity, like noticing a detail that didn't belong in the frame, his eyes scanning her uniform, the badge clipped slightly crooked, the folded cloth in her hand, and then the paper she was holding as if it had somehow crossed a line it wasn't meant to approach. "Excuse me," he said, not raising his voice, but the shift in tone was enough to tighten the air. Ava stepped closer, just enough to place the paper on the edge of the table, careful, respectful, her movements controlled. "There's a clause in there," she added, her voice steady. "It doesn't look like much, but it shifts the risk in a way that could come back on you." A murmur flickered through the room, subtle, quickly suppressed, and Ethan finally leaned back in his chair, studying her now, not the paper, not the clause, but her, the way she stood, the way she didn't rush her words or shrink under the attention. Then he smiled, faint, almost amused, and the tension snapped into something sharper. "And you saw this while cleaning?" he asked, a few quiet chuckles following his lead, polite, rehearsed, safe. Ava didn't react, didn't apologize, didn't step back. She just met his gaze for a second longer than expected. "I read it," she said simply. Ethan exhaled through his nose, glancing around the table as if sharing a private joke with people who would never contradict him. "That's impressive," he said, his tone light but edged. "But we have an entire legal team for that." More laughter, softer this time, but enough to fill the space between them. He tapped the paper once with his pen, then slid it aside without looking at it again. "Stick to what you're good at," he added, not unkindly, just firmly, like placing something back where it belonged. The room relaxed, the moment dismissed, conversations restarting in low voices, chairs shifting, the rhythm of power reasserting itself. But Ava didn't move right away, her hand lingering on the edge of the table for just a second before she pulled it back, nodding once. Not in agreement, not in submission, just acknowledgement. "Just don't sign too fast," she said, quieter now, almost lost beneath the hum of the air conditioning. But not entirely, because Ethan's pen hovered again, just for a fraction of a second, before he lowered it, the ink touching paper as if nothing at all had changed, and yet somewhere beneath the surface, something had already begun to shift. The signature dried faster than Ethan expected, the black ink settling into the thick paper with a permanence that felt heavier than the motion it took to create it, and yet his hand lingered there for a fraction of a second too long. The faintest hesitation barely visible, but enough for him to notice it himself. Around him, the room resumed its rhythm, voices layering over one another in confident tones. Projections discussed, numbers affirmed, the quiet certainty of people who believed. Everything had been accounted for, and Ethan nodded where he needed to, gave brief responses, but his attention kept slipping, not to the contract, not to the deal, but to a voice that had not belonged in that room, steady, unshaken, inconveniently precise. He leaned back slightly, adjusting his cuff as if resetting himself, but the words remained, repeating in a way that did not match their simplicity. "Just do not sign too fast," and it irritated him more than it should have, not because it challenged him, But because it stayed, the meeting ended with practiced efficiency, chairs sliding back, files gathered, assistants already moving toward the next obligation, and Ethan stood last, his gaze drifting for a moment toward the door where she had been, now empty. As if nothing had interrupted the flow at all, he stepped out. Into the hallway, the polished floors reflecting the overhead lights in long, uninterrupted lines, and for a second, he caught the faint scent of cleaning solution, something subtle, something easy to ignore, but it pulled at the edge of his awareness before fading just as quickly. The elevator ride down was quiet, the soft hum of descent filling the enclosed space, and Ethan stared at his reflection in the brushed steel, his expression composed, controlled, unchanged, and yet there was a tightness in his jaw that had not been there earlier. By the time he reached his car, the city had shifted into late afternoon, sunlight cutting between buildings in long golden angles, traffic moving in slow, deliberate patterns, and he settled into the back seat, glancing briefly at the folder beside him before looking away again. His driver asked something about the next stop, but Ethan waved it off, his attention already elsewhere, somewhere less defined. The penthouse greeted him with silence, the kind that echoed against high ceilings and glass walls, expansive and immaculate. Everything in its place, everything exactly as it should be, and he loosened his tie as he walked inside, setting the folder on the kitchen counter without opening it, choosing instead to pour a glass of water, the cool surface of the glass grounding in his hand. He took a sip, then another, but the quiet did not settle him the way it usually did, and after a moment, he set the glass down untouched, the faint ring of condensation forming beneath it. He exhaled slowly, then turned back toward the counter, his fingers resting on the edge of the folder before pulling it closer, almost without thinking. The pages slid open with a soft sound, familiar, routine, but this time his eyes did not skim. They searched, moving line by line with a focus that sharpened as he went, until he found it. A clause buried in dense language, structured to appear balanced, harmless, and yet something about its phrasing pulled at him, something subtle, something off. His brow tightened, and he leaned in slightly, reading it again, slower this time, tracing the implication not as it was presented, but as it would unfold, and the realization did not hit all at once. It unfolded, piece by piece, like a pattern revealing itself only when seen from the right angle. His grip on the page tightened just slightly, and for a moment, the entire room felt smaller, quieter, the city outside reduced to a distant blur beyond the glass. He leaned back, the paper still in his hand, and stared at nothing in particular, the silence now heavier than before. It was not just that she had been right, it was how easily she had seen it, how quickly, without hesitation, without access to the resources he relied on, and that thought lingered, unsettling in a way he could not immediately dismiss. He set the paper down carefully, aligning it with the rest of the stack, his movements precise, controlled, but his mind did not follow that same order. Instead, it circled back to a moment that should have been insignificant, a woman standing at the edge of a room that was never meant for her, speaking once, then leaving, and somehow leaving something behind. Ethan straightened, running a hand through his hair as if to reset the moment entirely, but the thought remained, persistent, quiet, impossible to ignore, and for the first time in a long time, the certainty he carried into every decision did not feel as solid as it had that morning. The city lights stretched across the glass walls like a grid of quiet decisions waiting to be made, each one steady, predictable, unlike the thought that refused to settle in Ethan's mind. And he found himself back at the counter again, the contract open, the same clause staring up at him as if it had been there all along, just waiting for the right pair of eyes. He read it once more, slower now, tracing each word not for what it said, but for what it implied, and the deeper he went, the clearer it became, the shift in liability, the quiet transfer of risk, the kind that would not show itself until it was too late to undo, and his jaw tightened slightly as he leaned back, exhaling through his nose, because this was not supposed to happen, not on his watch, not in a room full of people whose only job was to catch things like this. He reached for his phone, paused, then set it back down without dialing, because calling someone would mean explaining, and explaining would mean admitting that the first person to catch it had not been his legal team. Not his advisors, but a woman holding a stack of discarded papers, and the thought pressed against his pride in a way that felt unfamiliar. Instead, he picked up the pen again and tapped it lightly against the counter, the sound soft but rhythmic, a quiet echo in the otherwise still space. And with each tap came the same image, not of the clause, not of the numbers, but of her, standing there without hesitation, without apology, speaking as if she belonged in a room that had already decided she did not. He closed the folder with a firm motion, the sound sharper than intended, and pushed it aside. But the silence that followed only made the memory louder. Hours passed without him noticing, the sky outside shifting from gold to deep blue, the city below flickering to life in scattered lights, and still he had not moved far from where he stood, his thoughts circling the same question from different angles, not how she saw it, but why no one else did, why he did not. And that question lingered in a way that refused to be dismissed. He finally walked toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass, and for a moment he watched the traffic far below, the steady movement, the predictability of it, the comfort of systems that worked as expected. And yet tonight, something had slipped through, something small, almost invisible, but enough to disrupt the entire structure if left unchecked. He ran a hand along the edge of the glass, the surface cool beneath his fingertips, grounding, and then turned back, toward the counter again, because avoiding it was no longer an option. He reopened the folder, pulled out the page, and this time he marked it, a single precise line beneath the clause, his handwriting controlled, deliberate, as if reclaiming something he had almost overlooked. Then he stepped back, staring at it for a long second, before reaching for his phone again, this time not hesitating as long, his thumb hovering over the screen before selecting a contact. The line rang once, twice, and when it connected, his voice was calm, measured, but there was something underneath it, something sharper than usual. "I need you to review a section in the merger contract," he said, pacing slowly now, the quiet of the penthouse stretching around him. "Page 14, subsection C, and do not skim it. Read it carefully." There was a pause on the other end, a confident response, but Ethan did not relax, he did not sit. He just listened, his gaze drifting again to the marked line on the page, and even as the conversation continued, his mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying a moment that should have ended when the meeting did, but did not. When the call ended, he lowered the phone slowly, the silence returning just as quickly as it had left, and he stood there, still, the city glowing. Behind him, the contract open in front of him, and one thought settling in with a quiet certainty that felt heavier than any deal he had signed that day. He needed to see her again, not because he had to, but because something in the way she saw the world did not match the one he had built, and for the first time, that difference mattered. Morning arrived without the clarity Ethan expected, the light slipping through the floor-to-ceiling windows in pale streaks that stretched across the marble like quiet lines of pressure, and he was already awake before the sun fully settled over the city, standing near the counter with the contract still open, the marked clause now impossible to ignore. His phone buzzed once on the surface beside him, a message from his legal director, concise, confident, but lacking the certainty it usually carried, and as he read it, his expression did not change, though something behind it tightened. They had reviewed the section, they acknowledged the risk, they were already preparing a revision strategy, but what stayed with him was not their response, it was how long it had taken them to see it, how easily it had slipped past them until it was pointed out. He set the phone down slowly, his fingers lingering on the edge for a second before pulling back, and for a moment the room felt quieter than usual, not empty, but waiting, as if something unfinished had followed him into the day. He moved through his routine with practiced precision, the rhythm of it automatic, the suit tailored perfectly, the watch aligned just right on his wrist, every detail in place. And yet there was a subtle disconnect, like the surface remained untouched while something underneath shifted out of alignment. The car ride back to the office was smooth, the city already alive with motion, traffic lights blinking through the early haze, pedestrians crossing in steady patterns, and Ethan watched it all through the tinted glass, his gaze unfocused, his thoughts not on the meetings ahead, not on the deal he needed to correct, but on a single unresolved point that did not fit into any schedule. When he stepped into the building, the familiar energy greeted him immediately. Assistants moving with purpose, voices low but urgent. The quiet hum of a place that ran on expectation and control, and as he walked past them, they straightened slightly, acknowledging him without interrupting their flow, everything as it should be. But today, he did not head straight for the elevator. Instead, he slowed, his eyes scanning the lobby, the polished floors, the reflections shifting with every step, and then he turned, almost imperceptibly, toward a hallway that most executives never used, the one that led to the service areas, too. The spaces behind the structure that kept everything running without being seen. The air felt different there, cooler, quieter, the sound of footsteps softer against the less polished floor, and the faint scent of cleaning solution returned, subtle but unmistakable, grounding him in a way the glass and steel upstairs never did. He walked further, his pace steady but unhurried, until he saw her, Ava, near the far end of the corridor. A cart beside her, a folded cloth in her hand, moving with the same calm efficiency as before, her focus on the surface she was cleaning, not the world around her. He stopped a few feet away, not announcing himself immediately, just watching for a brief second as she worked, the small, precise motions, the quiet consistency, and something about it contrasted sharply with the noise he had left behind upstairs. Finally, he spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness but not harsh, just clear. You read contracts often, and she paused, not startled, just still for a moment before turning to face him, her expression neutral, composed, as if she had already expected this moment in some quiet way. Only when they are left where I can see them, she replied, her tone even, not defensive, not apologetic, just factual. Ethan studied her for a second, the distance between them small but defined, and for the first time, there was no audience, no room full of expectations, just a conversation that did not follow the rules he was used to. You were right, he said, the words measured, controlled, but carrying a weight that made them different from anything he had said the day before, and Ava did not react immediately, did not smile, did not shift her stance. She just held his gaze, steady, grounded, as if the acknowledgement mattered less than the truth behind it. The silence stretched for a second longer, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, and Ethan realized something in that pause, something he had not considered before, that this was not about being proven wrong. It was about understanding why he had been wrong in the first place, and why she had not been. The quiet between them did not break right away. It settled instead, like something intentional, something that did not need to be filled, and Ethan remained where he stood, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture no longer carrying the sharp edge it had in the boardroom, while Ava simply waited, not impatient, not curious in a way that demanded answers, just present. A distant sound of a cartwheel turning somewhere down the corridor echoed faintly, then faded, leaving only the low hum of the building behind the walls, and Ethan glanced briefly at the cleaning cart beside her, at the neatly arranged supplies, the folded towels stacked with care, every item placed with quiet precision, a different kind of order than the one he was used to, but no less deliberate. How did you see it? He asked finally, his voice lower now, not commanding, not dismissive, just direct, and Ava tilted her head slightly, considering the question not as a challenge, but as something worth answering. Carefully, because no one else was looking for it, she said, her tone calm, almost simple, but the words carried a weight that lingered in the space between them. Ethan frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought, his gaze shifting for a moment as he processed it. They were reviewing every line. He replied, almost out of habit, as if defending something that had always worked for him, and Ava nodded once, acknowledging that, but not yielding. They were looking for what they expected to find, she said, her voice steady, not what was actually there. The statement landed without force, but it did not need any, and Ethan exhaled quietly, his eyes returning to her, studying her in a way that was different now, not measuring, not judging, but trying to understand. And you were not? He asked, and Ava gave a small, almost unnoticeable shake of her head. I do not have expectations like that, she said. I just read what is in front of me. For a second, Ethan almost smiled, not out of amusement, but recognition, as if something in that answer connected to a part of himself he had not used in a long time, Before layers of experience and assumption had shaped the way he saw things, he shifted his weight slightly, glancing down the hallway and then back at her, aware now of how unusual this moment was, not just for him, but for the structure he operated within, where conversations like this did not happen, where people in her position were not asked for insight, only for completion of tasks. "What did you study?" he asked, the question coming more naturally than he expected, and Ava hesitated for the first time, not out of discomfort, but as if deciding how much to say. "Finance," she answered after a brief pause. For a while. And there was something in the way she said it that suggested a story without telling it. Something unfinished, something set aside rather than abandoned. Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly, not in skepticism, but in interest. "For a while," he repeated quietly, and Ava gave a small nod, her fingers adjusting the edge of the cloth in her hand. "Life does not always follow the plan you start with," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a quiet truth that did not need elaboration. Another silence followed, but this one felt different, less uncertain, more grounded, as if something had shifted just enough to allow it to exist without tension, and Ethan found himself standing there longer than he intended, not because he had nothing else to do, but because leaving would mean returning to a version of the day that no longer felt entirely complete. He glanced once more at the cart, at the hallway, at the space she occupied so naturally, and then back at her, his voice steady but changed in a way that was subtle, almost unnoticeable. "If you see something like that again," he said, pausing briefly before finishing the thought, "do not throw it away." And Ava held his gaze for a second, then nodded once, not as an agreement to him, but to the idea itself, and as Ethan turned to leave, the sound of his footsteps fading back toward the brighter, louder parts of the building, something followed him this time, not doubt, not irritation, but a quiet awareness that the world he moved through so confidently might have more to show him, if he was willing to see it the way she did. The rest of the morning unfolded the way it always did on the surface. Meetings stacked back to back, voices layered with confidence, projections laid out in clean lines across polished screens, and Ethan moved through it all with the same controlled precision that had built his reputation. But something underneath had shifted, subtle but persistent, like a note slightly out of tune that only he could hear. He sat at the head of the conference table again. The same glass, the same reflections. The same people who had nodded the day before now speaking with renewed certainty about adjustments and safeguards, their language sharper now, more cautious, as if correcting for something they had nearly missed, and Ethan listened, his hands folded loosely in front of him, his gaze steady, but his attention was not fully anchored in the room. One of his executives pointed to a revised clause on the screen, explaining how they had mitigated the risk, how the exposure had been minimized, how everything was now aligned with their expectations, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the work, but his eyes lingered on the text longer than necessary, not because he doubted it, but because he remembered how easily it had been overlooked before. "We will proceed with the revision," he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying authority without effort, and the room relaxed slightly, pens moving again, notes taken, decisions logged, the system restoring itself. But then he paused, just briefly, his fingers tapping once against the table, a small sound that drew a few glances without interrupting the flow, and he added, "And from now on, I want every contract reviewed twice, once for what it says, and once for what it hides." The sentence landed differently, quieter than a command, but heavier, and for a second, no one spoke, not because they did not understand, but because they did. The meeting continued, but the tone had shifted, just enough to be felt, not enough to be named, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting for a moment to the reflection of the room and the glass surface beneath his hands, the distorted shapes, the overlapping outlines, everything visible yet slightly altered depending on how you looked at it. When the meeting ended, the room cleared quickly, the usual rhythm resuming, but Ethan remained seated for a second longer, his hand resting lightly on the table, the faint imprint of the conversation still lingering in the air, and for a moment, he saw it differently, not as a place of control, but as a place where things could be missed if you only looked from one angle. He stood then, adjusting his jacket, and stepped out into the hallway, the noise returning immediately, phones ringing, footsteps echoing. the steady pulse of a building that never slowed down, and yet he found himself turning again, almost without thinking, toward the quieter corridor he had walked earlier, the one that did not demand attention, the one that did not announce itself. The transition was immediate, the sound fading, the light softening, the air carrying that same faint scent that had followed him since the day before, and he walked with a purpose now, not hurried, but certain, until he reached the same stretch of hallway where he had spoken to her. Ava was there again, a few feet further down this time, adjusting the position of a cart, her movements unhurried, consistent, and when she noticed him, she did not look surprised, only attentive, as if she had already accounted for the possibility of his return. Ethan stopped a short distance away, his posture relaxed but deliberate, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the quiet settling between them like something familiar now. They missed it, he said finally, his voice even, but carrying a different kind of weight than before, not frustration, not disbelief, just acknowledgement, and Ava nodded once, not as confirmation, but as recognition of something that had already been understood. Most people do, she replied, her tone unchanged, and Ethan studied her again, not as an exception, but as a perspective he had not considered until now. You do not, he said, and it was not a question, and Ava held his gaze for a moment before answering. I try not to, she said quietly, and in that space, with the noise of the building kept at a distance, the difference between them felt smaller than it had the day before, not because their worlds had changed, but because for the first time, he was not looking at hers from above, but from beside it. The hallway felt quieter than before, not because the building had changed, but because Ethan was listening differently now, the subtle sounds no longer fading into the background but settling into something he could actually notice, the soft glide of wheels, the faint brush of fabric against polished surfaces, the distant echo of voices that never reached this far, and he stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as if the pause itself held value. Ava returned to her work after speaking, not dismissing him, not avoiding him, just continuing with the same steady rhythm, her hand moving in smooth, practiced motions across the surface of a glass panel, the cloth leaving behind a clean reflection that caught the overhead light in quiet streaks, and Ethan found himself watching that reflection instead of her, the way it shifted depending on where he stood, how a small change in angle altered what became visible. You said you studied finance, he said after a moment, his voice calm, but carrying a different kind of curiosity now, not testing, not probing, just seeking, and Ava slowed slightly, not stopping entirely, as if adjusting her pace to match the conversation rather than interrupt it. Yes, she answered, her tone simple, grounded. A state school, about 40 miles from here. And Ethan nodded faintly, picturing it without needing details. The kind of place that did not appear in his world unless someone pointed it out. Why did you stop? He asked, the question. Direct, but not sharp, and this time Ava paused fully, the cloth still in her hand, her gaze shifting briefly to the reflection in the glass before returning to him. Because staying was not an option anymore, she said, and the words were quiet, but they carried something heavier than explanation, something that did not ask for sympathy or justification. Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he did not understand, but because he recognized the weight of what was not being said, the kind of detail that existed without needing to be spelled out, and he respected it in a way he had not expected. Do you still read them? He asked instead, nodding slightly toward the idea rather than the past, and Ava gave a small nod in return. Sometimes, she said, when I come across them. And there was no pride in her voice, no attempt to elevate it, just a simple acknowledgement of something she continued to do quietly. Without recognition, Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting again to the clean surface she had just finished, his own reflection now sharper there, clearer, and for a moment he saw himself not as the room saw him, but as part of the same space she moved through, subject to the same light, the same angles, the same limits of perspective. They missed it because they trusted the structure, he said, more to himself than to her, and Ava adjusted the cloth in her hand, folding it once with careful precision before answering. Structures are useful, she said, but they do not think for you. And the sentence settled between them with a quiet certainty that did not need emphasis. Ethan gave a slight nod, absorbing it, the idea not new in theory, but different in practice when spoken this way. Stripped of presentation, stripped of performance. A distant call echoed faintly from the main floor, someone asking for him. The urgency carried through the hallway like a reminder of the world he belonged to, and he glanced in that direction before looking back at her. The moment narrowing again, becoming more defined. If you had stayed, he said, his voice measured. What would you be doing now? And Ava considered the question for a second, not rushing to answer, her gaze steady. Probably the same thing they are, she said. Looking for what I expect to find. And there was a quiet irony in it, not bitter, not sharp, just honest, and Ethan almost smiled again. This time because he understood it. The call from the main floor came again, louder this time, pulling at the edges of the moment, and Ethan straightened slightly, the weight of responsibility returning to his posture, but not erasing what had just settled beneath it. I have to go, he said, and Ava nodded once, already turning back to her work, the conversation ending not with a conclusion, but with a quiet continuation, as if it would pick up again without needing to be forced. Ethan took a step back, then another, his shoes making soft contact with the floor as he moved away, the brighter lights of the main corridor drawing closer with each step. But even as the noise returned, the clarity of that quieter space stayed with him, not as a distraction, but as something sharper, something that cut through the certainty he had relied on for years, and for the first time, he did not try to silence it. The noise from the main floor closed around Ethan the moment he stepped back into it. Voices overlapping, screens lighting up with data, assistants moving with urgency that never seemed to slow, and yet something in him did not fully rejoin that rhythm, as if part of his attention had remained in the quieter hallway behind him. He walked into the next meeting already in progress, the door closing softly behind him, and every head turned just enough to acknowledge his presence before returning to the presentation, a projection of charts and projections stretching across the wall in clean, confident lines, the kind of clarity that usually settled his thoughts, but today it felt incomplete, like something important existed just outside the frame. He took his seat without interrupting, his posture composed, his expression neutral, and for several minutes he listened without speaking. The voices around him outlining strategy, risk management, timelines, all precise, all controlled. But his mind filtered through it differently now, not just hearing what was said, but noticing what was assumed, what was left unchallenged because it fit too neatly into expectation. One executive pointed to a projected model, explaining a projected margin that relied on a sequence of approvals that had not yet been confirmed, the confidence in his tone unquestioned by the others, and Ethan's gaze lingered on the numbers for a second longer than usual, not because they were wrong, but because they felt too smooth, too aligned. What happens if that approval is delayed? He asked, his voice cutting in calmly, not loud, but enough to pause the flow, and the executive hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, adjusting the projection slightly, offering an alternative scenario. But the room had already shifted, just slightly, the certainty softening into consideration. Ethan nodded once, not pressing further, but the moment stayed. And as the meeting continued, more questions followed, not aggressive, not disruptive, but precise, each one pulling at the edges of assumptions that had gone unexamined, and gradually the tone of the room changed, less certain, more attentive, as if everyone was now looking not just at what was presented, but at what might be hidden beneath it. When the meeting ended, the executives gathered their materials more slowly than usual. Conversations quieter, more thoughtful, and Ethan remained seated for a moment, his fingers resting lightly against the table, feeling the faint coolness of the glass, grounding himself in the physical space even as his thoughts remained elsewhere. He stood then, stepping out into the hallway again, but this time he did not turn immediately toward the quieter corridor. Instead he paused, watching the flow of people, the constant motion, the system functioning exactly as it was designed to. Efficient, polished, reliable, and yet no longer complete in his eyes. His phone vibrated in his hand. Another update, another decision waiting, and he glanced at it briefly before slipping it back into his pocket, choosing not to respond right away. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped inside alone, the mirrored walls reflecting him from every angle, each version identical, controlled, composed. And for a moment he watched those reflections, then looked down at his own. Hands, still, steady, but no longer untouched by doubt. When the doors opened again, he did not step out onto the executive floor. Instead, he pressed the button for a lower level, one that rarely appeared in his schedule, and as the elevator descended, the noise faded again, replaced by a quieter hum, a different rhythm, one that felt less defined but more real. The doors opened to the service level, the lighting softer, the air cooler, and Ethan stepped out. Without hesitation, his shoes echoing lightly against the floor as he walked with a purpose that no longer felt like obligation but choice. He reached the hallway again, the same faint scent in the air, the same quiet space, and he slowed as he approached, not because he was unsure, but because he recognized that this place required something different from him, something less immediate, less controlled. Ava was there, further down the corridor, speaking softly to another staff member, her voice low, steady, and when she noticed him, she finished her sentence without rushing, then turned toward him with the same composed presence he had come to recognize. Ethan stopped a few steps away, the distance deliberate, respectful, and for a second neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but full of everything that had shifted since the day before. "I changed the way we review contracts," he said finally, his voice even, but carrying something quieter beneath it. Not pride, not announcement, just truth. And Ava listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, attentive, as if the information mattered less than what it represented. "Good," she said simply, and there was no praise in it, no surprise, just acknowledgement, and somehow that made it feel more real than any approval he had received upstairs. Ethan nodded once, absorbing the simplicity of it, the lack of performance. And for a moment he stood there, not as someone delivering results, but as someone still learning how to see them. The word lingered longer than Ethan expected, not because of what it said, but because of how little it needed to say, and he stood there for a moment, the quiet hallway stretching around them, the faint hum of the building pressing softly against the edges of the silence, and for once, he did not feel the need to fill it. Ava had already turned slightly back toward her card, not dismissing him, just returning to what she was doing, the cloth moving again in slow, deliberate strokes across the surface in front of her, the reflection sharpening with each pass, and Ethan watched it, not her, the way the light shifted across the glass, the way clarity came not from force, but from attention. "It was not just the contract," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less structured, as if the words were forming as he spoke. "Them," and Ava paused again, not fully turning this time, just enough to listen. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone neutral, open, and Ethan took a breath, his gaze drifting briefly down the hallway before settling again. "We build systems to catch mistakes," he said. "But sometimes those systems make us stop seeing them." And as he spoke, the thought felt more defined, more real, something that had been forming beneath the surface now finding its shape. Ava considered that, her fingers, adjusting the cloth in her hand before folding it once, precise, controlled. "Systems are built by people," she said, "so they carry the same blind spots." And Ethan nodded slowly, the connection immediate, not theoretical, but something he had just experienced firsthand. Another quiet moment settled between them, but this one felt different, not just calm, but grounded, as if something important had been placed in the space between them without needing to be emphasized. From the far end of the hallway, a door opened and closed softly, footsteps echoing briefly before fading, and Ethan became aware again of where he was, of how far removed this space was from the world he usually operated in, and yet how much clearer things seemed here. "You see things differently," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Ava gave a small, almost unnoticeable nod. "I see what is in front of me," she replied, echoing what she had said before, but now it carried more weight, more context. And Ethan let out a quiet breath, something close to a laugh but softer, more restrained, as if he was recognizing something he had overlooked for a long time. "That might be the difference," he said, his voice low, thoughtful, and Ava did not respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because she did not need to. The silence held for a second longer, and then Ethan shifted slightly, his posture changing just enough to signal that the moment was moving forward, not ending, but evolving. Would you look at something else for me? He asked, the words coming without the hesitation they might have carried before, and Ava turned fully this time, her expression steady, her gaze meeting his without surprise, as if the request itself made sense within the logic of everything that had happened. If I have time, she said, her answer simple, grounded in reality, not obligation, and Ethan nodded once, accepting it without question, without negotiation, because for the first time, he understood that her perspective was not something he could command, only something he could ask for. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder, not the full contract this time, just a section, selected carefully, and he held it out slightly, not pushing it forward, just offering it. And Ava looked at it for a second before taking it, her fingers brushing the edge lightly as she opened it, her eyes moving across the page with a focus that was immediate, unforced. Ethan watched her, not the paper, the way her gaze moved, steady, unhurried, not scanning, but reading, and for a moment, the rest of the building felt distant, the noise, the urgency, the expectations all reduced to something secondary compared to the quiet act of simply paying attention. After a few seconds, Ava's eyes paused on a line, not dramatically, not with any visible reaction, just a slight stillness, and Ethan felt it before she said anything. The shift, subtle but real, and when she finally looked up at him, her expression unchanged, her voice calm. The words landed with the same quiet precision as before. This part does not say what they think it says. And in that moment, Ethan understood something clearly, not just about the document in her hands, but about the difference between looking and seeing, and how easily he had mistaken one for the other. The words settled into the space between them with a quiet weight, and Ethan did not respond right away, not because he doubted her, but because he recognized the pattern now, the subtle shift that happened just before something important revealed itself, and he stepped slightly closer, his attention narrowing to the page in her hands, the hallway fading into a soft blur of light and shadow around them. Ava did not rush, her eyes moving across the line again, not searching for confirmation, but for clarity, and when she spoke, her voice remained steady, almost gentle. They are reading this as protection, she said, her finger resting just beneath a sentence that seemed harmless at first glance. But it actually transfers responsibility if certain conditions are not met, and those conditions are not clearly defined. Ethan leaned in slightly, his gaze following where she pointed, and for a moment, he saw it the way he always had, structured, balanced, legally sound. But then something shifted, the phrasing opening up in a different way, the meaning no longer fixed but conditional, and his brow tightened as he read it again, slower, more carefully, the implications unfolding with each pass. That is intentional, he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and Ava gave a small nod. Not surprised. Most of the time it is, she replied. It is not about what is written, it is about how it can be used later. And the simplicity of her explanation cut through the complexity of the language in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Ethan straightened slightly, exhaling through his nose, the tension in his posture shifting into something more focused, more alert, and he took the folder from her hands carefully, not abruptly, just enough to bring it closer to his own line of sight. As if proximity might sharpen his understanding, the hallway remained quiet, the distant sounds of the building barely reaching them. And for a moment, everything narrowed down to that single page, that single oversight that had now happened twice, not by accident, but by design. This was reviewed, he said, his voice lower now, controlled but edged with something sharper beneath it, not anger, but realization, and Ava did not respond immediately, because she did not need to. The truth of that statement already clear. Ethan closed the folder slowly, the motion deliberate, his fingers pressing lightly against the cover as if grounding himself in the physical action, and for a second, he looked past her, down the length of the hallway, the quiet stretching out in front of him like a contrast to everything he had just come from. If this had gone through, he continued, his voice steady, it would not have failed immediately. And Ava shook her head slightly. No, she said. It would have worked exactly as expected, until it did not, and the weight of that landed deeper than any immediate consequence, because it meant the flaw was not in the outcome, but in the timing of it. Ethan nodded once, absorbing that, his mind already moving through the implications, the conversations he would need to have, the adjustments that would follow. But underneath all of that, there was something else, something quieter, the recognition that this was not a one-time oversight, not a single mistake, but a pattern he had not been looking for. He glanced back at her then, his expression composed but no longer distant. "You saw this in seconds," he said, not as a challenge, but as a fact he was still processing, and Ava met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I was not looking for confirmation," she said. "I was looking for meaning." And the difference between those two things settled into him with a clarity that felt almost uncomfortable, because it exposed how often he had relied on one instead of the other. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with everything that had just shifted, and Ethan felt it in the way he held the folder, in the way his thoughts moved, sharper now, less certain, but more real. From somewhere beyond the hallway, his name was called again, louder this time, pulling at the edges of the moment, reminding him of the world waiting for him to return, and he did not move right away, not because he could not, but because for the first time, he was choosing not to rush back into it without carrying something with him. "Thank you," he said finally, the words simple, but different now, not transactional, not automatic, and Ava gave a small nod, accepting it without reacting to it, as if the acknowledgement mattered less than what came after. Ethan turned then, the folder still in his hand, his steps measured as he walked back toward the brighter corridor, the noise gradually returning, the structure reassembling around him. But this time, something had changed, not in the building, not in the system, but in the way he moved through it, because now he knew that the most important things were not always the ones placed in front of him, but the ones hidden just beneath, waiting for someone willing to actually see them. The transition back into the main corridor felt sharper this time, the brightness more intense, the movement faster, voices rising and falling in quick succession as if nothing had changed, and Ethan walked through it with a steady pace, the folder still in his hand, but the weight of it no longer just about business. It carried something else now, something quieter, something that had begun to reshape the way he saw everything around him. He pushed open the conference room door without hesitation, the conversation inside stopping almost immediately as every head turned toward him, the shift in attention immediate, practiced, and for a second, no one spoke, waiting for him to take control of the room the way he always did. Ethan stepped forward, placing the folder on the table with a soft but deliberate motion, the sound cutting through the silence. And he did not sit right away, he remained standing, his gaze moving across each person in the room, not quickly, not impatiently, but carefully, as if seeing them in a different way for the first time. "We are not moving forward with the current version," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a firmness that did not invite debate, and a slight tension rippled through the room, subtle but noticeable, a shift in posture, a glance exchanged between two executives, the quiet recognition that something had changed. One of the senior partners leaned forward slightly, his expression controlled. "We addressed the clause you pointed out," he said, his tone respectful but confident. "The revisions are solid." And Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the effort, but not yielding. "You addressed one clause," he replied. "There is another." And the words landed with a quiet weight that drew immediate attention. He opened the folder, turning it toward them, his finger resting lightly on the section Ava had identified, and for a moment, no one spoke, their eyes scanning the text, their expressions tightening just slightly as they read. The realization not instant, but building, unfolding in the same way it had for him. "This changes the entire risk structure," someone said finally, their voice lower now, less certain, and Ethan did not respond right away. He let the silence stretch, let them sit with it, let them see it fully without interruption. It was reviewed. Another voice added, quieter this time, almost defensive, and Ethan's gaze lifted, not sharp, not accusing, but steady. "Yes," he said. It was, and the simplicity of his response carried more weight than any explanation could have. The room fell into a deeper silence then, not just because of the oversight, but because of what it implied, and Ethan finally took his seat, leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, grounded, present, from this point forward. He continued, his voice even, measured. We do not just confirm what we expect to see. We challenge it, every line, every assumption. And the shift in tone was clear, not just a correction, but a change in approach, something deeper than a single fix. One of the executives nodded slowly. Others followed, not out of obligation, but because they understood the weight of what had just been exposed. The vulnerability in a system they had trusted without question. Ethan leaned back slightly then, his gaze drifting for a brief second to the reflection in the glass table, the distorted outlines of the room beneath him, and for a moment, he saw it again, the difference between what appeared clear and what actually was. The meeting resumed, but the energy had changed, less certain, more attentive, each word chosen more carefully, each assumption examined more closely, and Ethan listened, not leading as forcefully as before, but guiding in a way that allowed space for something else to exist, something more aware, more precise. When the meeting ended, the room emptied slower than usual, conversations quieter, more thoughtful, and Ethan remained seated for a moment, the folder still open in front of him, the marked lines no longer just corrections, but reminders. He closed it gently, the motion controlled, and stood, adjusting his jacket as he stepped back into the hallway once more, the noise returning around him, the system continuing as it always had. But this time, he carried something different with him, not just the authority to decide, but the awareness to question, and somewhere in the quieter part of the building, a perspective he had once dismissed had already begun to change the way he moved through everything. The building began to quiet as the day stretched into evening, the sharp edges of urgency softening into a slower rhythm, lights dimming in certain offices while others stayed bright, holding on to unfinished work, and Ethan stood near the window of his office. The city spread out beneath him in long lines of moving light, steady, predictable, almost distant. The folder rested on his desk behind him, closed now, but not forgotten, its presence less about what it contained and more about what it had revealed, and for a moment he did not turn back to it. He just stood there, watching the reflection of himself faintly layered over the skyline, a version of him that looked unchanged, composed, certain, but no longer entirely accurate. He exhaled slowly, then reached for his jacket, slipping it on with a measured motion before stepping out of the office. The hallway quieter now, fewer voices, fewer interruptions, the building transitioning into a different kind of space, one where things slowed down just enough to be noticed. He did not take the elevator this time, instead choosing the stairs, his footsteps echoing lightly with each step down, the sound consistent, grounding, and when he reached the lower level, the air felt cooler, the silence deeper, familiar in a way that no executive floor had ever been. The service hallway stretched ahead of him, the same soft lighting, the same muted tones, and as he walked, he noticed details he had overlooked before, the slight variations in the walls, the way the light shifted at each turn, the quiet evidence of work that kept everything else running without recognition. Ava was there, near the end of the corridor, finishing up for the day, her cart partially packed, a few supplies neatly arranged as she moved with the same steady precision, and when she saw him, she did not look surprised, only attentive, as if this had become a natural extension of something neither of them had planned. Ethan slowed as he approached, stopping a few feet away, the distance familiar now, respectful, and for a second neither of them spoke, the quiet settling between them like something understood, rather than uncertain. "We are revising the entire structure," he said finally, his voice even, but carrying a different kind of weight now, not authority, not instruction, just truth. And Ava nodded once, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the cart. "That makes sense," she replied, her tone unchanged, grounded in a way that made the decision feel less like a reaction and more like the only logical step. Ethan studied her for a moment, not searching for approval, but recognizing the consistency in her perspective, the way it did not shift based on who he was or what he had decided. "You helped prevent something that would have cost a lot more than money," he said, the words measured, deliberate, and Ava held his gaze for a second before responding. "I just said what I saw," she said, and the simplicity of it cut through everything else, reducing the complexity of the situation to something almost effortless. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that, and for a moment, He looked down at his hands, then back at her. The space between them no longer defined by position, but by something quieter, something earned through understanding rather than status. "You should not be here," he said, not as a dismissal, but as an observation, and Ava tilted her head slightly. Not defensive, just curious. "Where should I be?" she asked, and Ethan paused, the question settling into him before he answered. "Somewhere your perspective is not ignored," he said, and the words carried a weight that was not about offering something, but about recognizing something that already existed. Ava considered that for a moment, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and then she gave a small nod, not agreeing, not rejecting, just acknowledging the thought. "Perspective does not depend on where you stand," she said quietly. "It depends on how you look." And Ethan let out a slow breath, something close to a quiet laugh, not out of amusement, but recognition, because once again, she had said something simple that carried more truth than the structures he had built around himself. The silence returned, but it felt complete now, not waiting for anything else to be said, and Ethan stepped back slightly, his posture shifting as if preparing to leave, but not in a hurry. "If you are willing," he said, his voice steady, "I would like you to keep looking." And this time, the request was clear, not implied, not indirect, and Ava met his gaze, her expression calm, thoughtful. "I already do," she replied, and there was no need to say anything more after that. Ethan nodded once, accepting it, understanding it, and as he turned to walk back toward the stairwell, the quiet of the hallway followed him for a few steps before giving way to the echo of his own movement. The building still standing, still functioning, but no longer quite the same, in the way he experienced it, because somewhere along the way, he had stopped just looking at it and started actually seeing it. The night settled gently over the building, the last of the office lights dimming one by one until only a few remained, glowing like quiet reminders of unfinished thoughts, and Ethan stood alone in his office again, the glass walls, reflecting both the city outside and the stillness within. A space that once felt like control, now carrying something softer, something more aware. The contract lay on his desk, revised, corrected, no longer a risk, but he did not reach for it, because what mattered had already happened long before the ink was fixed, and he understood that now in a way he had not before. He moved slowly across the room, his footsteps quiet against the floor, and paused near the window, his reflection faint against the lights below, not as sharp as it had been earlier, not as defined, but more honest somehow, as if the edges had softened just enough to let something real show through. His phone buzzed once on the desk behind him, another message, another decision waiting, but he let it sit, the sound fading into the quiet, because for once, urgency did not feel like priority. Instead, his mind drifted back to a different part of the building, a quieter hallway, softer light, a voice that never needed to rise to be heard, and the way everything had shifted from that single moment when he chose to listen instead of dismiss. He turned away from the window then, walking back toward the desk, his hand resting briefly on the edge before moving past it, not stopping, not needing to, and instead heading toward the door, the choice simple, unforced. The hallway outside was nearly empty now, the usual noise replaced by a low hum that echoed through the space, and Ethan walked through it, without slowing, his steps steady, deliberate, not driven by obligation, but by something quieter, something that had taken shape over the course of the day. When he reached the stairwell, he did not hesitate, pushing the door open and descending once more, the sound of his footsteps returning in soft, consistent echoes, grounding him in each step, and when he reached the lower level, the air felt the same as before, cool, still, familiar in a way that no executive floor had ever been. The service hallway stretched ahead, quieter now than at any point during the day. The lights dimmed slightly, the space almost empty, and he walked down it slowly, not searching, not expecting, just present. Near the far end, Ava was there, finishing the last of her work, the cart nearly empty, the surfaces around her already clean, reflecting the soft light and calm, even lines. And when she noticed him, she did not speak right away, just looked at him with the same steady calm that had never changed. Ethan stopped a few feet away, the distance familiar now, comfortable, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, the silence holding everything that had happened without needing to repeat it. He looked around briefly, at the hallway, at the quiet work that had already been done, at the reflection of light on glass and steel, and then back at her, his voice low, but clear. "I used to think control meant knowing everything," he said, not as a statement to impress, but as something he had just learned to question, and Ava listened, her expression unchanged, attentive in a way that did not interrupt. "Now I think it might mean knowing when you do not," he added, the words settling into the space with a quiet honesty that did not need reinforcement. Ava held his gaze for a second, then gave a small nod, not in agreement alone, but in recognition of something earned rather than given. The moment lingered, not heavy, not uncertain, just complete, and Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath that felt lighter than any he had taken that day, not because the world had changed, but because he had. He stepped back then, not in retreat, but in understanding, his posture relaxed, his presence quieter, and as he turned to leave, the hallway remained still, unchanged in appearance, but different in meaning. Ava returned to her work, the final motions simple, precise, and Ethan walked toward the stairwell once more, the sound of his footsteps soft against the floor, the building above him still waiting, still moving, still demanding, but no longer the only place where clarity existed. He reached the door and paused for just a second, his hand resting lightly on the handle, before pushing it open and stepping through. The echo of the hallway fading behind him, replaced by the distant hum of the world he knew so well, and yet now moved through differently. And somewhere between those two spaces, not in the boardroom, not in the silence, but in the quiet space between them, something had shifted, not loud enough to be announced, not dramatic enough to be